This is the story of how one piece of music triggers the worst 10 things about Musescore. Coming in at problem number 10, Legato Slop and the painful process of de-slopping. Number 9, the missed opportunity of mezzo. Dud notes are in at number 8, and a particularly prevalent form of dud, ornaments, at number 7. They're spotty, man. Formatting quirks that just happen, represented by Auto-Bloat at number 6. And at 5, interaction traps, including hidden mode triggers and hidden scroll bars. Whoops, what happened? And when you've gone wrong like that, you want to undo, but you're lost in space. Yeah, undo, panic, undo, redo, undo. And coming into the top 3, and we've got a piece of junk that is another huge missed opportunity. Want to find out how it works, or how anything works? Good luck. Muse's 404 is at number 2. And the biggest problem, topping the chart of frustration, Muse Sounds confiscation. You might have bought their stuff, but they're not going to let you use it. I really caught the bug for Musescore and Muse Sounds when I heard playback of an original composition and realised how good it sounded. I'm still a huge fan, despite what you'll hear in this video. The quality of Muse playback from music notation means you can compose and perform your own orchestral music, plus you can interpret the classics by grabbing a score and then reshaping it to offer an expressive performance. And being your own conductor and orchestra is a way to learn from the great interpreters, to try out ideas, old and new, and dig deeper into the music. Hence, this channel. While I've done episodes on my own stuff, I've done more on movements of symphonies and suites and the story behind the music that I've discovered as I research. With Musescore, I'm representing Stokowski's revision of Romeo and Juliet and trying to out-Berlioz Berlioz. Right now I'm in the middle of a series on Johann Strauss the Younger to celebrate his bicentenary. Originally there was going to be a single video, but then I discovered the Viennese lilt and musicological analyses of performances of the Blue Danube and lots of fascinating things. And I also discovered that this piece, the Blue Danube, triggers everything wrong with Muse. So this is a bit of a rant about the frustrations of the notation program Musescore Studio, the sample libraries Muse Sounds, the place you download them from, Muse Hub, and the organisation behind them all. There's the Musescore Studio logo. Used to be this logo, now it's this. They've gone heavy metal. Meanwhile, improvements keep coming, but the big frustrations remain. Muse, if you're listening, we're on the same side. I love your stuff, but see how much better it could be. Anyhow, the Blue Danube. Let's load up a score, assign some Muse Sounds instruments to the different staves, and have a first try at the big theme. It's mushy, blurry. Let's try a single line. Start at the top with the flute. Let's move somewhere louder so we can better hear what's going on. What? Again? So our first problem is Musescore Muse Sounds instruments play everything legato. And look in the tweets of the main Blue Danube theme, we've got repeated notes, same note twice, and so they're just blurred together. It's horrible legato slop. How can we fix it? Try staccato? Nope, that's too spiky. Maybe something like this. Well, it's getting better, more to try because we want to get it right, because look how many we'll have to do. If only there were a way to turn off the blur. Hurrah! Muse Sounds has a way to turn off the blur. Classic phrasing, which means it will interpret slurs as legato and not play legato everywhere else. But it's not available for lots of instruments, not for any of the woodwind, for example. And it's broken. Here's the beginning of the strings for the big theme with the slurs highlighted and now with the repeated notes highlighted. You see how often one of the two repeated notes is under a slur? Proper phrasing would make breaks because the other note isn't. Unfortunately, classic phrasing in Musescore thinks being under a slur just means play the note legato, so it slops the legato outwards. So repeated notes all over the place in this first waltz of the Blue Danube don't get properly separated. So we have to fix that artificially. Now, staying with phrasing, wouldn't it be great to have a proper mezzo staccato? Here's a page from the Oxford Concise Dictionary of Music. Look how handy these symbols are. Mezzo or semi-staccato, shortened by a quarter, so play 3/4 the usual length. Staccato, half the usual length. Staccatissimo, shortened by 3/4, so play 1/4 the usual length. Now, note duration is only part of how players interpret these symbols. Staccato for strings often is delivered through spiccato, which is a way of bouncing the bow, so it's a different articulation, and it changes the timbre, the attack of the sound as well. With all that said, Muse misses mezzo, and here's why it matters. Where notation falls down relative to doors is on note start and stop times. Now, you always can notate. If you want to crotchet or quote a note to finish early, you can change it to this, or earlier still to this, or to start later, or start earlier. Using notation to adjust the start times of notes is what I did in my video on the Viennese lilt, where all of these are about the second note starting before the second beat. But these notation hacks are ugly. You don't need onset adjustment that often, but wouldn't it be great if you could change the durations simply, rather than changing crotchets to dotted quavers everywhere? Wouldn't it be great if we had all 4 possibilities from the Oxford Dictionary, plus a slur over the notes to give legato? What we actually have varies from instrument to instrument. Here's the Muse free flute playing. What you hear and can see in this visual display of the waveforms is that instead of legato, standard, 3/4, a half, a quarter, you get legato, legato slop, quarter, 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 or staccatissimo, staccatissimo, staccatissimo. This varies from instrument to instrument. Here's the bassoon. It's playing legato, legato slop, half, half, quarter. So this time we do have a staccato, but still no mezzo staccato. Some instruments do play the different cases differently. Here's the violins with classic phrasing turned on. Looks like they've cracked it. Except no, I don't know whether the mezzo is generated from the staccato or some other way, but what strikes me about all the mezzos is they aren't the sound we want for 3/4 length notation. What do we want? Well, when I started this channel, I thought the very first movement of a symphony I'd share would be the Allegretto from Beethoven's 7th. It's well known, it's beautiful, it's not too difficult. It has mezzo staccatos. Here's the straight playback. Ugh. Wikipedia expresses it very well, though they say potato, I say mezzo staccato. We want a smooth pulsing articulation. Now Muse might say there isn't much call for mezzo staccato. Okay, but Muse's staccato is quite spiky, especially when it's really a staccatissimo, like with the flute. And there are lots of pieces written staccato that want it gentle, like everything except the violins in the introduction to Handel's Zadok the Priest, or everything in this bit of Smetana's Vltava, or lots of ballet music. And there are places without an explicit staccato where the gentle bounce would be just the right thing, like every Strauss waltz. In the score, these pa-pas are not notated with staccato, but straight notes don't have the energy and bounce. They need mezzo staccato. The workaround I've used is what's playing now. I've seeded some of the parts, in this case the 3rd and 4th horns and the bass trombone, with staccatos, but that's a poor substitute for proper mezzo staccato in all the pa-pa parts. When you work around the absence of mezzo staccato, like this for example for the Muse flute, it seems these isolated quavers trigger the duddest of Muse Sounds dud notes. Listen to that E. For some reason, the samples of isolated notes are the least secure. The workaround for that is to use a different instrument. I have a video about choosing instruments, and so far as the flute goes, a better choice is the Spitfire flute or the Berlin flute. You have to pay for those, but at least you get a better sound. Yet still, you keep uncovering quirks of instruments. You thought you had the best of flutes, then it turns out they can't play trills, or they can play some and not others. Spotty ornaments. Here, for example, I'm using a particular flute that I've paid for. Here's a trill. Oh, it works. And here, it's a written out trill. Why? Well, because if I left it as a cymbal, it wouldn't trill at all. A feature here is that the trill that works crosses bar lines, whereas the ones that don't. Some ornaments don't cross bar lines well. Take the string tremolos at the start of the Blue Danube. String tremolos start softer in Muse Sounds, and these restart soft at the beginning of every bar. By the way, this example shows a tremolo tip. They can be tricky because of the danger of a machine gun sound with the mechanical repetition of notes. To reduce the effect, you can split chord tremolos into individual instruments. I'm using the solo violin that I mix in low with the main first violins to carry one of the lines. Muse really have done remarkable things with engraving, and that's engraving on the fly, managing to make the score stay beautiful even while you're changing it. But there's still a problem with score bloat. Sometimes you can be adjusting something and the space between staves mysteriously increases. That kind of vertical bloat often disappears when you reload the score next time. Not so for horizontal bloat. Here's an example. I want to change this hairpin to start when the instrument starts sounding, so I select it, click, and then select the left drag handle and drag to the right, and this happens. And after it happens, it won't go away. You have permanent horizontal bloat. Now I'll show you the particular auto-bloat problem that the Blue Danube triggers. In a way, it's my own fault for choosing this piece to do. I didn't realise at the start what a challenge the timing would be. Effectively, there's two levels of timing variation in a Strauss waltz. The within bar lilt, how early the second beat comes. Then there's a lot of tempo variation, particularly at the beginnings and ends of sub-waltzes. My previous two videos are dealing with these two different aspects of tempo. Although I presented my lilts video in terms of notated rhythms, I realised that because these two types of variation are overlaid, in the final version it would make sense to handle both the lilt and the higher level variation in the same way. In other words, I'd have to have the tempo changing very frequently, maybe every beat. The first thing was to check that Musescore would do that correctly. In the lilts video there's a piano comparison of the different rhythms. Here's the actual score that I wrote, played, then snipped into pieces to provide that. But at the same time I created the same rhythms just by varying the tempo note by note. Then I output that audio and compared the two waveforms carefully, and yes, Musescore does support beat by beat tempo variation and does it correctly. So then in the final thing there's going to be lots of tempo variations. Here it is. Now again, this shows what an idiot I was thinking a Strauss waltz would be easy. I mean, you do have to feel the tempo, and this note-by-note typing in of numbers is the opposite of feeling. You have to try something quite mechanically, then switch off the finicky calculating part of your brain as you play back, try to feel, then switch it back on again, first a little to try to deduce what to tweak to make better, then go full left brain, changing tempos, and then back again to the feeling side. But I have a workflow for this, and at least it's tolerable. Except for the way Musescore bloats the sequence of tempos, putting them further and further up in a staircase. Now if you go back and edit, sometimes a whole string might be pulled down closer to the stave. But I haven't managed to do that with this long stair here. Why is it like this, Muse? You give us a great feature, finely controlled tempo, and then the user interface means you can't tell which notes your tempo marking refer to. And sometimes you have to zoom out and out just to reach rungs at the top of the ladder. Now, while the hairpin example I gave first is a relatively common thing, this problem with tempos only happens when you need a lot of tempo variation. But I've included it because we're now coming to the big five of Muse problems, and the tempo ladder is a handy way to illustrate one of these. Interaction traps. Interaction in Musescore 4 is by and large really good. That's not surprising with Martin Keary, composer and graphic designer, in charge. As Tantacruel, Martin makes hilarious and wise videos. As head of software at Muse, he's put user experience first. But still, there are interaction traps. The first type is when Musescore's behaviour isn't what you'd expect, but Musescore doesn't trouble to explain. You save your work and it jumps to a different place in the score. You close the window, and even though you've just saved, the spinny thing spins and spins, and you wait and wait. Sometimes the spinny things never stop spinning, and in a way that's more reassuring because it means the program's crashed, whereas when it does actually close after a full minute, you're left wondering, what was it doing all that time? The second type of trap is when a hidden power shortcut gets triggered by a user mistake and chaos ensues. The most common of these is when you're editing text, though it can also happen when you're switching from another window. You inadvertently click in white space. You think you're editing text, but now all the hotkeys are alive. In particular, type a number or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you're entering notes. I'll show you how that happens with tempo change because I've done a lot of that in the Blue Danube. First, we'll change that tempo of 100 to 110. That seems to work. Now to change the next 100 to 120, select the item and miss. Now you type the new tempo in anyway, and the numbers are interpreted as note lengths. Another click to get out, and you've added a monstrosity like this. Then there's hidden scroll bars. You're happily making adjustments, get to the last, and unbeknown to you, the individual scroll bar at the bottom of the screen comes alive. But you don't see it because the slider isn't where you are, so you click thinking you're selecting a note, but no, your scroll bar clicks you to some wildly distant location. Now there's some discussion online about whether you can make the scroll bars always visible through accessibility settings. I haven't found that on my Mac-based system, and the online chat suggests these individual scroll bars are hard-coded. So these are just two examples of interaction traps that have an explanation, but when you're trying to get stuff done, you can get dislocated and lost. And that leads to the biggest interaction trap of all. So big, I've given it a special number, undo. Musescore has a multi-level undo. Trouble is, it doesn't take you back to the place where you're undoing. So if you've made a mistake like the hidden scroll bar jump, you're left lost. Maybe you panic and do undo again, or redo, but nothing changes. Wouldn't it be great if undo took the view back to where that last edit was made? Better still if it highlights exactly where the change happened, but even without the highlight, so long as we're back to the location, we can undo redo a few times until we spot exactly where in the window it is. Now, the volume of instruments doesn't always increase smoothly as you go up the dynamics register, and the effects of accents also seem to make the loud too loud relative to the soft. One traditional way of dealing with loudness gradation is with a compressor. Here's the compressor in the digital audio workstation Logic. I'm using it to post-process an audio file I've exported from Musescore. You could almost say I'm mastering it. Now this looks complicated, so let's zoom in. The graph shows how input volumes or loudness are mapped to output loudness, and this curve is saying that for soft sounds they go through as they are, but louder sounds get compressed in loudness. Really, you just control two things: where this knee is, which you set with the threshold knob, and how much the range of volumes above the knee is compressed, which is controlled with this ratio knob. Okay, once you've compressed, you've reduced the maximum loudness, so there's also this knob, which adds some gain and moves the transfer graph up and down like this. You don't have to have that last knob if you have a volume slider in line with the compressor that can do the lift in volume. So just two controls. And you've seen how this compressor helpfully shows when it's applying compression, but you don't have to have that feedback. Now, when you're working with orchestral music, individual parts have accents, marcato marks, as well as all the dynamics, and you adjust these to get the blend you actually want. So you'd like to be able to hear the effect after compression while you're making the tweaks. Here's the Musescore mixer, so that master compression stage we were just looking at in Logic would fit in here. In fact, the mixer lets you plug in for individual instruments as well. So if you got one that was particularly uneven from one dynamic level to the next, like the free Muse Sound trombones, for example, you could stick a compressor in just for that channel. I say you could because, in fact, you can. MuseFX compressor to the rescue. Here it is. Remember, all we want is a threshold knob to say when to start the compression and a ratio knob to say how much. What this is a menu of selections. Who knows what half of them even mean? And an unlabeled knob. Look, it goes up to 11. Ho ho. Here's what you want, here's what you get. You try to find out what it all means, and all you dig up is dispiriting conversations. We're supposed to be able to work it out for ourselves. Well, I can't. You know, what's really needed here is someone who can not only express how awful the interface is, but also give a clue as to why it's that way and suggest how to fix it. Failing that, I'll have a go. I can guess that the implementer has looked at compressors like Logic's and said, there's a lot of knobs on there. My brief is to be both simple and powerful, and no one has ever explained that simple means straightforward rather than with a minimum of controls. So I'll identify some use cases, like bass guitar, for example. Work out not just what the typical settings for all these knobs are, but also how you navigate the 6-dimensional space of threshold, ratio, knee, attack, release, makeup using just one magic nonlinear knob for bass guitar. And then I'll do it for something else like kick drum. This is quack medicine. Not just because half the diagnoses, the menu entries, are impenetrable, pumping master, vocal ride, but because the gamut of diagnoses is so limited. None of these labels help me decide which to use for my use case. And the medicine, what the magic knob actually does to address the needs of the diagnosis, is shrouded in voodoo mystery. Look, Muse, if you have to have this stupid interface with one knob, here's how to do it. Label the menu threshold and label the items something like this, maybe even add a line of explanatory text, then label the knob ratio and give it a sane scale, maybe again with a line of explanation. Of course, this is not just a cosmetic change. You have to make sure those controls actually do the things they claim. But at least that should be simple to verify. Right now, because of the compressor's cloak of mystery, it must be near impossible to verify. In fact, does it actually compress at all? Maybe it does, but Muse won't tell. Here's the sum of their documentation. And now, the total documentation for all of MuseFX. As for Muse Sounds, you're reliant on advertising guff, like these descriptions of 4 string libraries, which means you don't get consistent documentation across sample libraries. Although there are nuggets of information, like the Berlin strings are recorded in traditional orchestral positions, we don't know if that applies to the others. Muse wants to be simple and cheap, so they don't offer all the microphone positions you get in a DAW sample library. Fair enough, but just tell us about the microphone position you have given us. Why? Because the Musescore mixer is offering us pan and reverb, tempting us to think of instruments as monosources we can place in the stereo space. But Berlins are already spaced, maybe others are too, and keyboard instruments seem to be recorded wide across the stereo field. We need more information. As for Musescore Studio itself, well, it's well designed, so kind of self-documenting, but when you want to know about slurs in Musescore 4, this happens. How about grace notes? You can find out quite a lot from the Musescore 3 documentation, but this for Musescore 4 tells you Muse don't care. They should read Rory Sutherland on what this kind of neglect does for a brand. I have a deadline for my Strauss celebration video, 25th of October 2025, Johann's 200th birthday, and that means deadlines for the Prelude videos on Tempo. I was preparing the first when I came to Musescore one day, hit playback and heard this. What is that awful noise? Open the mixer and my paid for instruments have been replaced with MS Basic, an old synthesized substitute, close to the deadline and no usable music. I knew what was going on because it had happened before, although that time all my Muse sounds were taken out of the mixer. For over a weekend, the musescore.org site and the Musescore Discord channel were buzzing with users and Muse employees' messages about how the Muse Hub rights management server was not validating instruments. It was a bug on their end. They worked hard to fix it, but because Muse insists on some validation handshake between your machine and their server, you can't use your sounds. In fact, it happened before that too. And since. And I'm not the only one. Look on the forums and see similar things from other users. Sometimes you can fix it locally by uninstalling and reinstalling Muse Sounds. Maybe the libraries got corrupted, which is a way of expressing Musescore or Muse Hub corrupted the libraries, or more likely, since they're supposed to be read-only, they have some other kind of bug. You can't work like this, Muse. You can't confiscate users' products that they've paid for and expect to build customer loyalty. Surely you want people to use your product, buy into your ecosystem, and trust you so they do more and start using you for mission-critical applications. I'm just a guy with a small YouTube channel, but the last time this happened to me was 3 days before the release of this video. And I'm frustrated. You have to fix this for all our benefits.